There has always been a line. Since 1945, since the moment the first atomic bomb turned Hiroshima into ash, there has been an unspoken but universally understood boundary in international conflict. You do not cross into nuclear territory. Not directly, not openly. Not in a way that forces the other side to respond in kind. Iran just crossed that line. Not by detonating a weapon. Let me be precise about what I mean, because precision matters enormously here. Iran has crossed the nuclear line not by using a nuclear device. They do not yet have one deployed in this conflict. They have crossed it by doing something that, strategically, changes the equation in the same way. They have demonstrated, publicly, unambiguously, and in front of the entire world, that they can hit any target we have in the region. Any target. With weapons we cannot stop. And they have made clear, through official statements, through military positioning, through the behavior of their missile forces over the past several weeks, that if this war continues to escalate toward the destruction of the Iranian state, their response will escalate with it. That is the nuclear line, not a device, a threshold of capability and intent that changes what every other party in this conflict can do and cannot do. And America has no answer. Not no good answer. No answer. The systems designed to intercept the weapons Iran is now deploying do not work against them. The strategic options that would normally exist for a power in our position have been foreclosed by decisions made months ago. The diplomatic channels that should have been maintained as exit ramps were allowed to collapse. We are standing at a threshold that we do not know how to cross and cannot afford to cross. And the question that nobody in Washington is willing to answer, the question that the entire world is now asking, is, what do we do now? That is what I want to talk about today. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am not a nuclear alarmist. I have never been. Over the course of a long career in and around the military, I have watched people use nuclear language carelessly, as a rhetorical device, as a way to generate attention, as a substitute for serious analysis. I have always resisted that. What I am saying today is different. It is based on a specific assessment of a specific military situation, grounded in specific capabilities that Iran has demonstrated, and specific gaps in American defensive architecture that have been apparent to serious analysts for years. I have been in the rooms where nuclear scenarios are discussed, not the public discussions, the serious ones, where officers and analysts with genuine expertise sit down and work through what escalation actually looks like, step by step, decision point by decision point. Where the question is not whether nuclear weapons are scary, everyone knows they are, but what specific combination of circumstances creates the conditions under which they become thinkable to the people who have them. I wrote a paper on nuclear command and control. People can read it on my Substack. It addresses exactly the structural questions that are now relevant to what is happening in the Gulf. The point I was making then, and the point I am making now with far greater urgency, is that we have not thought carefully enough about the scenarios in which nuclear use becomes a serious possibility. We have relied on deterrence theory that was designed for a bilateral US-Soviet confrontation and assumed, without adequate examination, that it would translate intact into a multipolar world with multiple nuclear-armed states and multiple overlapping alliance commitments. It does not translate intact, and the situation in the Gulf right now is the proof. I was also in conversations with people who knew Trump before this war. I knew him. I spoke with him. And what I saw was a man who had genuine instincts against military adventurism, who understood, at some level, that America's history of regime change projects had produced more instability than stability, more enemies than friends. That man would not have brought us to this point. The man who has brought us to this point is operating under pressures and influences that have overridden those instincts. And understanding who those people are and what they want is essential to understanding how we arrived at a moment where Iran has crossed the nuclear line and America has no answer. Let me explain what crossing the nuclear line actually means in strategic terms. Because I think the phrase is being used in the media in ways that are either too alarmist or not alarmist enough, and neither extreme is useful. The nuclear line, what strategists call the nuclear threshold, is not a single point. It is a zone. A set of conditions that, when they are met, change the calculations that nuclear-armed states and their partners make about what actions are possible and what actions are too dangerous to contemplate. Before a state crosses the nuclear threshold, conflict can escalate through conventional means, with a reasonable expectation that both sides will stop short of existential decisions. After a state crosses it, every escalation carries a different kind of risk, because the capabilities that are now in play are capable of producing outcomes that cannot be recovered from. Iran has crossed that threshold, not by having nuclear weapons, by having something that in the current operational environment functions strategically like nuclear weapons in one critical respect: they cannot be stopped, and they can be used to destroy any target their operators choose. Let me give you the specific capability I am talking about: Iran's hypersonic precision-guided missile systems. These weapons travel at speeds between 5 and 10 times the speed of sound. They maneuver during flight, which means they cannot be intercepted by systems designed for ballistic trajectories. They carry payloads large enough, in some configurations several thousand pounds of high explosive, to destroy hardened targets. And they hit what they aim at, every time. The best estimate I have been able to obtain from people whose judgment I trust, people with genuine access to the relevant intelligence, is that Iran began this war with approximately 45,000 missiles in total inventory. The hypersonic and precision systems represent a fraction of that total. But a fraction of 45,000 is still an enormous number, and unlike the older systems, which Israeli and American air defense could intercept at a meaningful rate, these weapons are not being intercepted. 8 out of every 10 missiles launched at Israel in recent weeks have penetrated Israeli air and missile defenses. 8 out of 10. That number was 5 out of 10 at the start of the conflict. It is getting worse, not better, as Iran deploys more of its advanced inventory. Now here is the strategic implication that I do not think is being communicated clearly enough. We have no defense against these weapons in the current theater. The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, THAAD, was designed for a specific class of ballistic threat. It performs poorly against maneuvering hypersonic vehicles. The Patriot PAC-3 system has similar limitations. The Israeli Arrow 3 system, which was specifically designed for the high-altitude intercept mission, has been partially effective against some Iranian systems, but has demonstrated no reliable capability against the hypersonic variants. What this means, in plain language, if Iran decides to use these weapons against American assets in the region, against our carrier strike groups, against our land bases, against our command and control infrastructure, we cannot stop them. Now let me be precise about where we are right now. Iran has not yet made that decision. The current Iranian campaign has focused primarily on Israel and on the Gulf states that have permitted American forces to operate from their territory. The direct targeting of American carrier strike groups has not occurred, though American ships have been struck by other Iranian systems. But here is what has changed. Iran has demonstrated the capability, publicly, repeatedly, in a way that every military analyst in the world, including every analyst in the Pentagon, can observe and verify. And it has made statements, through official channels, that make clear the targeting of American assets directly is not off the table if the escalation continues. That demonstration of capability, combined with that statement of intent, is what I mean by crossing the nuclear line. It is not a nuclear weapon. It is the creation of a situation in which the United States faces a choice between accepting a strategic outcome it does not want or taking actions that risk a response it cannot defend against. That is exactly the position that nuclear weapons are designed to create. Iran has created it without them, and we have no answer. Let me be specific about what no answer means. It does not mean we have no military options at all. It means the military options that exist, escalating strikes, attempting to destroy the underground facilities where these weapons are stored, imposing additional costs on the Iranian economy, have all been assessed by serious professionals and found inadequate to the strategic problem. Escalating strikes cannot reach the weapons stored in deep underground facilities in eastern Iran that have never been touched by this campaign. The missiles in those facilities, by the estimate I cited earlier, have not been subjected to any attack at all. They are intact, they are ready, and there are thousands of them. Destroying the Iranian economy through the blockade is producing consequences for the global economy, and increasingly for the American economy, that are arriving faster than the pressure on Iran is becoming unbearable. Iran is a continental power with supply lines through Russia and China that the blockade cannot interdict. It has resource sovereignty, domestic energy, water, arable land, that allows it to sustain a siege far longer than the global shipping system can sustain the disruption the siege is producing. And the diplomatic option, the ceasefire, the negotiated off-ramp, has been foreclosed by the sequencing of decisions made over the past several months. Iran's position is now explicit. There will be no ceasefire until the United States withdraws its forces from the region, lifts the blockade, releases frozen assets, and formally commits to never threatening Iran again. Those are not negotiating positions that can be quietly modified. They are statements made publicly in the context of a conflict in which Iran believes, correctly I would argue, that it is winning. Let me give you the evidence, not analysis, evidence. 4 things that have happened that, taken together, prove that Iran has crossed the nuclear line and that America has no answer. Proof point 1, the hypersonic demonstration. Iran did not use its most capable weapons at the start of this conflict. This is not speculation. It is visible in the progression of what has been deployed. The first weeks of the campaign saw primarily older Shahab series ballistic missiles, Fateh-class short-range systems, cruise missiles derived from Soviet-era designs. These systems are lethal but interceptable. Israeli and American air defense handled them at rates consistent with pre-war assessments. Then, beginning several weeks into the conflict, the profile changed. The weapons being used became faster, more maneuverable, more accurate, and demonstrably impossible to intercept with the systems in place. The penetration rate, the percentage of missiles reaching their targets, climbed from roughly 50% to over 80%. Iran did not run out of older weapons and have to fall back on newer ones. Iran made a strategic decision: demonstrate the capability at the moment of its choosing, in a way that cannot be misinterpreted. Show the United States, show Israel, show the entire watching world that there is a tier of Iranian military capability that exists beyond anything the current theater air defense can handle. That is not a military tactic. That is a strategic communication. Iran is saying, we have held this back. We are showing it to you now. Understand what it means. Proof point 2, the underground facility reality. Trump announced we destroyed Iran's Air Force. He announced we destroyed their Navy. The briefings from the Pentagon have been a continuous stream of targets struck, facilities damaged, leadership eliminated. What has not been announced, what cannot be announced, because the honest answer is damaging, is what has not been struck. The large underground facilities in eastern Iran. These are not small installations hidden in mountain tunnels. They are massive complexes, purpose-built over 2 decades, hardened to withstand the most powerful conventional munitions in the American arsenal. The weapons stored in them, the advanced missiles, the hypersonic systems, the production equipment for additional munitions, have not been touched. Before the war began, the estimate I received from people I trust was 45,000 missiles total. The weapons used in the first months of this conflict represent a portion of that inventory. The portion in hardened underground facilities in eastern Iran represents the rest. Those weapons are intact. Those production lines are still running. That capability has not been degraded. Every briefing that counts targets struck without addressing those facilities is doing exactly what the briefings from 1967 Vietnam did, measuring inputs while ignoring the output that matters. We flew X sorties. We dropped Y bombs. Meanwhile, the enemy's fundamental military capacity is untouched. Proof point 3. American defensive architecture has failed. I want to be specific and technical here, because I think the failure deserves to be named precisely rather than buried in vague language about challenging threat environments. THAAD was designed for ballistic missile threats on predictable trajectories. It was not designed for maneuvering hypersonic vehicles. The engineering physics are different, and the intercept geometry is different. Using THAAD against Iranian hypersonic missiles is like using a tool designed for one job on a completely different job. The tool is excellent at what it was built for. This is not what it was built for. Patriot PAC-3 has similar limitations at the high end of the threat spectrum. It performs well against cruise missiles and short-range ballistic threats. Against maneuvering hypersonic vehicles at high speed and high altitude, its intercept probability drops to levels that professional assessors describe as not reliable. The Navy's Aegis system, which provides the fleet's primary air and missile defense, has demonstrated some capability against the lower-tier Iranian systems. Against the hypersonic variants, it faces the same fundamental challenge. The intercept timeline is too compressed, and the maneuverability of the threat is beyond the engagement envelope the system was designed for. This is not a failure of the individual systems. They are performing as designed. The failure is the assumption, built into decades of American defense procurement and planning, that adversaries would not develop the specific capabilities needed to defeat these systems before we develop the next generation of defenses. Iran developed those capabilities. We did not develop the defenses in time, and the result is a defensive architecture that provides meaningful protection against maybe 60 to 70% of what Iran can throw at us, and no reliable protection against the rest. In a nuclear context, 60 to 70% is not enough. It is not even close to enough. Proof point 4. Iran's conditions for peace are America's conditions for defeat. Iran's stated terms for ending this conflict are public. They have been stated clearly, officially, repeatedly. They are not opening negotiating positions designed to be bargained down. They are statements of what Iran believes it has earned the right to demand, based on its assessment of the military situation. Those terms: complete American military withdrawal from the Middle East, permanent end to military threats against Iran, full lifting of all sanctions and blockade measures, release of frozen Iranian assets, all of them upfront, not phased, formal compensation for damage done in this conflict. Now, set aside whether those terms are just or unjust, reasonable or unreasonable. Ask a different question. What does the fact that Iran is stating these terms tell you about Iran's assessment of the military situation? A party that believes it is losing does not state maximalist terms. A party that believes the military balance is turning against it does not publicly announce conditions for peace that include the complete withdrawal of the world's most powerful military from an entire region. A party that is afraid of what comes next does not tell the other side, "We will wait until your president leaves office in 2029 rather than negotiate with his administration." Iran is stating those terms because Iran believes, correctly, based on the military evidence, that it has crossed into a position from which it can dictate rather than negotiate. That is the nuclear line, not a weapon, a position. And America has no answer to that position. How did we arrive at a situation where Iran has crossed the nuclear line and America has no answer? This did not happen randomly. It happened because of specific decisions made by specific people, and those people have not been held accountable, and unless we understand who they are and what drove their decisions, we will make the same mistakes trying to find the exit that we made creating the entry. Start with the intelligence failure. The foundational assessment, the one that told the president this would be a short campaign, that the Iranian government would fall in days or weeks, that the population was ready to rise up, that the regime was brittle. That assessment was wrong, not slightly wrong. Catastrophically wrong at every significant point. It was the Israeli assessment, the Mossad analysis, the same intelligence apparatus that failed to detect the Hamas attack of October 7, 2023, somehow became the authoritative basis for the most consequential American military decision in a generation. And when America's own intelligence community, the CIA, the DIA, the analysts whose entire careers are built around understanding adversary capabilities and intentions, when those professionals raised objections, when they assessed the Iranian government as more resilient and the Iranian military as more capable than the Israeli assessment suggested, their analysis was set aside. Trump chose to believe the Israelis. He has said as much. His advisors reinforced that choice. The people around him who had the professional expertise and the institutional standing to challenge the Israeli assessment were either not in the room or were not heard. Now, I want to address something directly, because I think it is important and I think it is being avoided in most of the public commentary. The people who have shaped this president's foreign policy, on Israel, on Iran, on the entire architecture of Middle East strategy, are not primarily motivated by American national security. I know this is uncomfortable to say. I say it not to assign blame, but to explain a dynamic that has directly produced the situation we are now in. When Trump was asked whether Iran threatened his aircraft at the NATO summit in Turkey, when the Mossad said yes and the CIA said no, he believed the Mossad. When the question was whether to enter this war, the same pattern operated. The people whose assessment he trusted were not the people whose job was to tell him what was true. They were the people whose interests were served by the war. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of political independence. A president who cannot distinguish between advice that serves American interests and advice that serves other interests has lost the most basic capacity that the commander-in-chief role requires. I wrote about this. I spoke about it before the war began. I said then, and I say now, that the capture of American foreign policy decision-making by interests that are not American interests is the root cause of the strategic catastrophe we are now experiencing. The result is a military engagement that was designed to serve Israeli strategic objectives, the destruction of Iran as a functioning regional power, the permanent elimination of the threat that Iran represents to Israeli regional dominance, using American military resources at the cost of American military readiness, in a conflict that produces no benefit for the United States and enormous costs. And now we have arrived at the endpoint of that policy. Iran has crossed the nuclear line. The military options are exhausted. The diplomatic options have been foreclosed. The economic pressure is producing more damage to the global economy than to Iran. And the president is being told, by the same people who told him this would be over in 4 days, that there is still a path to victory if he just does a little more. There is not. And the people telling him there is are not serving American interests. They never were. History has produced, several times, the specific situation we are now in. A great power, fully committed to a conflict, facing an adversary that has developed capabilities the great power cannot counter, without an exit strategy, without a clear diplomatic path, with its domestic political system unable to acknowledge the strategic reality. The historical record of what follows is consistent, and it is not encouraging. The first parallel is the most direct. France in Algeria, 1958. France had been fighting an insurgency in Algeria since 1954. By 1958, the French military had concluded that the war could not be won by the methods being employed, but also that France could not withdraw without a political catastrophe at home. The government in Paris was paralyzed. Every option that might actually end the conflict was politically impossible. Every option that was politically possible was militarily insufficient. The result was the collapse of the Fourth Republic. The inability to resolve the Algerian question through normal political channels produced a crisis so severe that the entire French constitutional system failed. Charles de Gaulle returned to power, not as a democratic choice, but as an emergency, the only figure credible enough to impose the settlement that the political system was incapable of reaching. The settlement, when it finally came, involved accepting a strategic outcome that France had spent 4 years insisting was unacceptable: Algerian independence, French withdrawal, the loss of territory and prestige that the French political system had said it would never accept. The question for the United States right now is not whether we will eventually accept the strategic outcome that Iran is imposing. We will. The question is how much additional cost, in lives, in treasure, in global credibility, in military readiness, we will pay before we accept it. The second parallel is more recent and more precise. The Soviet Union facing the United States in the late Cold War, specifically the period from 1983 to 1986. The Soviets had built a military that was formidable in most conventional dimensions, but had fallen behind in the specific technologies, stealth, precision guidance, electronic warfare, that were transforming the battlefield. American investments in these capabilities through the 1970s and early 1980s had created what military planners call an offset strategy. The United States could not match Soviet conventional forces in Central Europe, man for man or tank for tank. But it didn't need to. The new technologies created capabilities that Soviet conventional mass could not counter. The Soviets recognized this. Their response was not primarily military, it was political. They concluded that the military balance had shifted in a direction that could not be reversed by conventional military competition, and they began the political process that eventually produced the end of the Cold War. The lesson: when a military balance shifts to the point where one side has capabilities the other side cannot counter, the side without the answer does not find the answer through more of the same. It finds the answer through political adjustment. America is now in the position the Soviets were in 1983. Not in terms of overall military power, we remain the strongest military force on Earth in most dimensions. But in the specific theater, against the specific capabilities Iran has developed, we do not have a military answer. And the history suggests that the only real answer is political. The third parallel is the one that cuts closest. America in Vietnam, the period from 1968 to 1972. By 1968, the military situation in Vietnam was such that every serious military professional knew the war as being fought could not be won. The Tet Offensive had shattered the official narrative. The body counts and the sortie counts and the bridge destruction statistics that filled the briefings bore no relationship to the strategic reality on the ground. The political system's response was not to acknowledge the reality and begin the political process of extracting the country from the conflict. The political system's response was to find new ways to describe the same situation more favorably, to change the metrics, to redefine what victory looked like, to escalate in ways that produce short-term tactical results while leaving the strategic situation unchanged. 4 more years, tens of thousands more American dead. The degradation of the American military institution to a point that took 15 years to begin repairing. All of it paid to sustain a political narrative that everyone in a position of responsibility knew was false. The nuclear line that Iran has crossed does not give us 4 more years. The economic consequences of the Persian Gulf disruption are arriving in months, not years. The military readiness gaps created by this conflict are already visible and already constraining our ability to respond to other threats. The regional isolation that this war has produced is already permanent in its key features. We do not have the luxury of the Vietnam delay. The reckoning is coming faster, and the question is whether anyone in Washington has the clarity and the courage to begin shaping it before it arrives on its own terms. Iran has crossed the nuclear line, that is a fact. America has no military answer to the specific capabilities Iran has demonstrated. That is a fact. The diplomatic options that might have provided a non-military answer were foreclosed by decisions made in the first months of this conflict. That is a fact. The economic pressure the blockade is creating is producing more damage to the global economy and arriving faster in the American economy than it is producing strategic change in Iran. That is a fact. Iran is a continental power with supply lines through Russia and China that cannot be interdicted. It has resource sovereignty that allows it to sustain a siege longer than the global shipping system can sustain the disruption the siege creates. That is a fact. Iran's stated terms for ending this conflict: American military withdrawal from the Middle East, permanent end to military threats, full sanctions relief, compensation for damages, are not opening positions. They are statements of what Iran believes it has earned the right to demand. That is the assessment of serious analysts who have no interest in making the situation sound worse than it is. And here is the verdict on what all of those facts add up to. The United States has been maneuvered by a combination of bad intelligence, captured decision-making, and the absence of serious strategic thinking into a position where the only available exit from this conflict involves accepting outcomes that the political system has repeatedly said are unacceptable. That gap, between what is politically sayable and what is strategically necessary is the most dangerous gap in American national security right now. More dangerous than any Iranian missile. Because the missiles are a military problem, and military problems, however severe, have military dimensions that can be managed. The gap between political reality and strategic reality has no military dimension. It can only be closed by political courage. Iran has no nuclear weapons deployed in this conflict, but it has created, through conventional military means, the strategic situation that nuclear weapons are designed to create. A situation where the other side faces a choice between unacceptable outcomes, with no clear path to a better one. And America's answer to that situation is what it has always been when the political system cannot acknowledge strategic reality. More of the same. I do not accept that this ends badly. I refuse to accept it. Not because the situation is not serious. I have spent the last 30 minutes telling you how serious it is. But because I have seen situations that looked worse than this one turn around, when the right people found the courage to say the right things at the right moment. Let me tell you what the right things are. The military leadership of this country has to speak. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the chief of naval operations, the commander of CENTCOM. These are people with constitutional responsibility and professional obligation to ensure that the President of the United States receives an accurate picture of the military situation. Not a filtered picture. Not a picture designed to support a policy that has already been decided. The actual picture. The actual picture is what I have described today. Iran has crossed the nuclear line in strategic terms. American air and missile defense cannot reliably intercept the weapons Iran has demonstrated. The underground facilities in eastern Iran that contain the bulk of Iran's advanced missile inventory have not been touched. The economic consequences of the blockade are accumulating faster than the strategic pressure on Iran is becoming decisive. That picture, delivered honestly, by people with the credibility and the institutional standing to make it stick, is the foundation of any exit strategy. You cannot find the exit if you refuse to see where you are. The second thing that has to happen is a genuine reassessment of what American interests in this conflict actually are. Not what Israeli interests are. Not what the interests of the financial networks that have purchased American political influence are. American interests. What does the United States actually need from the Middle East? It needs access to energy markets, but that access has been destroyed by the conflict, not protected by it. It needs regional stability, but the conflict has produced the most significant regional instability in decades. It needs to maintain the credibility of its security commitments to allies, but the conflict has demonstrated, to every ally that is watching, that American commitments can be manipulated by parties whose interests diverge from ours. The honest answer to what American interests require in this situation is the answer that the political system cannot currently say: disengage. Manage the disengagement carefully, in a way that preserves as much American credibility as possible, that provides for the safety of American personnel, that creates the conditions for genuine diplomatic settlement. But disengage. Over 60% of the American people support disengagement. The economic data supports disengagement. The military readiness data supports disengagement. The regional political situation supports disengagement. The only thing that does not support disengagement is the political infrastructure that has been built over 30 years by interests that are not American interests, to ensure that American policy in the Middle East serves those interests regardless of what the American people or American strategic necessity requires. That infrastructure is powerful. I will not pretend otherwise. But it is not omnipotent. And the situation that Iran has now created, by crossing the nuclear line and presenting America with the question it cannot answer, is the kind of situation that forces political systems to confront realities they have been avoiding. Iran has 45,000 missiles. It has hypersonic weapons we cannot stop. It has supply lines we cannot interdict. It has a population unified by 4 decades of conflict with us, prepared to absorb damage that would break any Western society, waiting out this president and the next if necessary. We have a military that is the most capable in the world in most dimensions. deployed in a theater where those capabilities do not translate into the decisive advantage they would produce elsewhere, against an adversary specifically prepared for this fight, running out of the specific munitions that this specific conflict requires. The answer to that situation is not more bombs. It is not a better blockade. It is not the nuclear option that some people in Washington are quietly discussing. The answer is the one that every president who has faced a comparable situation has eventually, at enormous cost, been forced to reach. Acknowledge the strategic reality, find the exit, pay the political price, and use whatever remains of American credibility and American power to shape the post-conflict environment in a way that serves actual American interests. That is the answer America does not yet have. It is the answer we must find. And we must find it before Iran's crossing of the nuclear line produces the escalation that no one, not America, not Iran, not Russia, not China, can control. The line has been crossed. The clock is running. And the only question that matters now is whether Washington can find the clarity that this moment demands.